Well, welcome friends. We are in our fourth week of Laurus, and we are continuing our pattern of delivering this to you digitally. A quick note, when I send this out, I will be emailing you, and you will get in the email, Aaron McKinney is going to be setting up a Zoom meeting. So our plan is on Sunday, this upcoming Sunday, at 10:05 a.m. for us to meet on Zoom. And that's something you can do on your computer, or it's something you can do by calling in. But the hope is that we can kind of have some dialogue, because last week's class, I spoke for an hour, but we didn't have a chance to dialogue. And so our hope is this will be a little bit shorter, and then on Sunday we'll dialogue with each other. So just keep an eye out in your email. You might have already gotten it by the time you watch this. But we're starting today with page 147 to 220. To 220. And so we're still in the book of renunciation. I'll just put book of R, and then about page 180 we get to the book of journeys. Book of journeys. And so as we've talked about, not only are there these kind of characteristic changes when Arseni's name changes, but there are these different kind of stages he's walking through. And so we'll begin our discussion in the book of renunciation, and we'll end in the book of journeys, but the book of journeys will continue on afterwards. So I'm going to kind of do some highlights today. I'm not going to go in as much depth as I did last time. Since we are getting a chance to dialogue, I hope you'll kind of formulate some questions and bring that to the discussion. So I just want to go through a couple of things that stood out to me, ask some questions, and then I'll kind of close with a couple of points. But we start this book with Arseny kind of fully becoming the holy fool. Scott Wilson's with us in the room, and I'm going to ask him a question. How's the ink color?
It's very blue.
So you can see it?
I can see it.
Okay, good. Hello again. So this is when he becomes a holy fool in fullness. Now you remember from last class, Foma had kind of set him off on this journey to become a holy fool. And there was that quote like the elder Nicander gave him when he was leaving the village of Urkina. And so now that he becomes a holy fool, he kind of fully takes on the name Eugene. And one other thing that kind of happens is he's completely silent. He speaks to Ustina throughout this, and he speaks to Foma some, but to the townspeople of Skov, he is completely silent. And so for this period, he's a holy fool. His name's Eugene, and for the most part, he's silent. It's also this time that he builds his it's kind of like a little abode, like a makeshift abode or a shed in the convent cemetery. So he's in the convent cemetery, and that's where he begins to live. And so we're thinking through the implications of this. It's tying in to renunciation or mortification. And so that's a big part of what's going on here. Is this idea of renunciation / mortification. And this is happening through a number of times. He's giving up the kind of ease of comfort and all of those things, but he's also literally mortifying his body. He's living out in the convent cemetery. It's cold, it's uncomfortable. They're feeding him food, and he lets it kind of fall into the earth. And when it's kind of the earth has soaked it all up, he'll eat the rest. And so there's this process of mortification, of renunciation going on. Something to think about in this section is, what's the point and the purpose of this? And how does it make you feel as a reader? It kind of, I don't want to say kind of, it seems extremely foreign to us, especially to us in the 21st century, living in a very modern world. So think about those things as we're going through this. So this pivotal part happens around page 159, 160, and that is there is a baker, loaf baker is what he's called, Prochor. And Prochor is, he has his hawker's tray, and he's walking around with his loaves of bread, and Arseny comes and swats it. And we find out later Arseny swatted it because Prochor had had an intimate moment with his wife, and before making the bread, he never washed his hands. And so Arseny was trying to stop all the people from eating that bread, which was considered kind of desecrated. And so Prochor just completely batters Arseny and basically brings him to the point of death. And so he's brought back to the convent, and he kind of recovers in that period. During that period, his kind of ability, this mortification ability that he's adapted to, this kind of ability to withstand the cold and not really feel the body, kind of leaves him. And so if you've got your book with you, you can turn to 160. So on page 160, this is after he's recovering from the convent. The nuns are saying, please stay inside. And he says, no, I'm recovered enough. I'm going back out to his little abode, to his shed on the kind of periphery of the cemetery. And it says, I'm right at the beginning of 160, when Arseny returned to the entwined oaks, he realized he had become unaccustomed to a difficult life. He mourned his loss the weeks he spent in the cell, for they had forced him to pay attention to his body. And so his whole period of mortification has been essentially a forgetting of his body. It's been kind of like a heightened spiritual battle almost. And now Prochor attacking him and him recovering from that has led from that mortification kind of going backward. And so that's what I'm kind of driving at here to think about is what is the role of mortification? And it seems like it's almost like not a sport, but like a practice that has to be kept up. And Arseny has lost a lot of that through the attack. So after the attack, he recovers. And Prochor asks his forgiveness, and as he's asking his forgiveness, he begins to bring Arseny bread that he has made. Arseny forgives him. He's a very holy person. He doesn't hold grudges. And this is all part of that holy, full personality. These are these people that live outside the bounds of society, but they have a holiness about them because of that. And so we're noticing with Arseny, his kind of story is increasing as far as his holiness and the ways that is told. There's a term used to describe books on saints, and that's hagiography, and it's typically a life of a saint. So it's really big in Catholicism. You'll hear the lives of the saints, but for our intents and purposes, it's a story about a saint or a holy person that kind of covers their life, but focuses on the miracles they perform. And so the book is slowly turning into a hagiography. You'll hear this term used as like a denunciation sometimes of like an uncritical biography about someone. Like if someone wrote about someone that had, some ups and downs in their life, but they just put the ups. The term hagiography is applied to that, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a life of a saint, and that's essentially what's becoming to happen. And what's happening is Arseny, who has turned into a holy fool, has not left his healing behind. It's almost like it's against his will he heals. And so the bread he begins handing out to people, we see on page 161, it says, I'm kind of at the little below the middle. From that day on, loaf baker Prochor called on Arseny fairly frequently. He brought a loaf each time, sometimes more than one. Arseny took the loaves gratefully. After Prochor left, he took them to the convent wall and gave them to people of modest means. With time, however, it was not only they who awaited the loaves from Arseny. People came from the city and from Zapskoyev, and many of them were considered well-to-do. These people were not tormented by hunger, but they knew the loaves from Arseny's hands were unusually tasty and wholesome. They had observed that these loaves imparted strength, stopped bleeding, and improved the metabolism. So what's going on here is that Arseny, his healing capacity is going out beyond just his willfully doing it. Him literally touching these loaves of bread is bringing healing. And so this is another thing to think about. The story is progressing, and as the story progresses, I told you earlier on, the healing becomes more and more a form of faith healing. And I also want you to think about, for someone like Arseny, who's going through these different stages and trying to work out this long-term repentance for what happened with Justina and the baby, how is his identity as a healer kind of continuous? There's a continuity to it throughout this entire story. Pay attention to that. Think about what that means, and what does it mean to have this kind of gift or this talent that you can't get rid of. And I'm not saying he's trying to get rid of it, but his time as a holy fool doesn't start with him trying to heal. You have to remember the period before this was healing, and it kind of stopped when he first got to Scove. So one really cool thing that happens in this section, and I'm sure you kind of picked up on this. Well, this is a mess. Oh, I think these things stick together, forgive me. Anyhow, on page, basically from page 167 to 180, and this ends the book of Renunciation. This is that kind of moment I was talking about, hagiography. There's a quote I'm going to read in a second, but essentially what happens from this point on is any sense of linear time is lost. It's just a series of episodes of healing and miracles that Arseny performs in Scove and the surrounding area. He's healing different people, and it kind of starts with, there's this terrible winter that comes on, and Arseny gets up, and because he's living outside, and to stay warm, he starts moving through the town. And as he's moving through the town, he starts to kind of take care of folks that have fallen asleep outside, a lot of drunks, a lot of homeless people, and he's either bringing them home or taking them to a temporary shelter outside the convent. The story is told primarily focusing on these holy moments, right? These miracles, these healings. But there's this thing that Vodolazkin is doing throughout the book, and that's he's disrupting our sense of linear time. And so pay attention, because it starts, if you pull out your book, on page 167, there's this beautiful quote at the bottom. It says, "From then on, time definitively began moving differently for Arseny. More precisely, it stopped moving and remained idle. Arseny saw events taking place on earth, but also noticed that events had, in some strange way, diverged from time and no longer depended on time. Sometimes events came one after another, just as before. Sometimes they took a reverse order. Rarer still, events arrived in no order whatsoever, shamelessly muddling prescribed sequences, and time could not cope with them. It refused to govern those sorts of events." So I think this is something I'd really like to talk to you all about. Why is this happening, and why can time not cope with these events? But there's this kind of mixing of eternity, not in the sense of what time will be like in heaven, but kind of like that timelessness intruding upon time. So these events aren't told in a linear sequence like dot, 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 but they're just kind of told like this, right? They're just kind of happening all around. And there's nothing connecting them like we would think of time. Rather, they're just these events happening around. We'll later learn that Arseny was a holy fool for 14 years. And while you're reading this, you just don't get a sense of like what's happening, or is Arseny aging, or is something happening in the town? And it just kind of like everything flows together. But think about that and what that means. One thing that happens in this time is really important to point out before we kind of end this section, and that is Arseny is, in his kind of winter rambling, helps a drunk guy get home, and throughout that time he gets disoriented. It's snowing, he can't really tell what time it is, time of day, and he gets lost. And in that period of getting lost, he becomes disoriented and gets so cold, and he starts knocking on people's doors, and people are turning him away, and he eventually finds some dogs sleeping together. And as he finds them, he crawls in and he sleeps with the dogs. And this is actually before that quote on 167. It's on 166. Speaking of messing up time. So I'm going backward. On page 166 in the middle, it talks about him sleeping with the dogs, and it says, "That is how vile I've become," Arseny told Justina. "God and man have left me, and even the dogs want nothing to do with me either, so they left. My body, all dirty and turned blue, is loathsome even for me. This all indicates that my bodily existence is pointless and nearing its end, meaning, my love, you will not be pardoned because of my prayers. So what's going on here is Arseny is essentially about to die. And he sees his whole life in the frame of, I am working to heal, to serve repentance, I should say, for Ustina. And he sees himself coming to an end, and he kind of tells Ustina it's all over. And then in that moment, at the very end, this person appears. It's at the very bottom of 166. As Arseny had thought that, he sensed warmth gradually filling him from within. So right on the cusp of dying, he starts to feel warm. After opening his eyes, he saw before him a young man with a splendid appearance. His face shone like a sunbeam, and in his hand he held a branch scattered with scarlet and white flowers. The branch did not look like branches from the decaying world, and its beauty was unearthly. Who is this person? I have no clue. I've been thinking about this. I want you to think about it. It's obviously not someone from this world. So I was like, well, it's probably an angel. Could it be Christopher? Could it be his dead son? I don't know. Think about that. The reason I thought Christopher was because there's this kind of herbal healing medicinal sense with the branch, and he hits Arseny with the branch. But anyhow, on page 167 at the top, this angel, this person says, O Arseny, take invincible life for your whole body, and the cleansing and the ceasing of your sufferings from this bitter cold. So gain strength and healing from this cold. And with those words, the fragrance of the flowers and life granted to him a second time entered Arseny's heart. So Arseny is kind of revivified here. When he raised his eyes, he discovered the young man had become invisible. And Arseny understood who that young man was. He remembered the life-giving verse, where the Lord wills it, the natural order is overcome, because according to the order of nature, Arseny should have died, but he was scooped up and returned to life as he was flying off toward death. So I don't know who this is. Some of you might be like, Will, you're an idiot. This is who it is. And no. So we'll talk about that on Sunday. The one thing is that quote, he says the life-giving verse, where the Lord wills it, the natural order is overcome. That's from a famous preacher named John Chrysostom, who was a famous kind of saint and preacher in the Orthodox tradition. His name essentially means John the Golden Mouthed. So I don't know if it's trying to say it's him. I don't know. I'm confused about this. I don't think it's something for us to focus on, rather than just a miracle of healing has been given to Arseny here. So that kind of is this section. I actually kind of jumped backward, and so this next section is that time where there's just all these healings. The one thing to point out is on page 180, the other loaf baker, Samson, goes and kills Carp, the third holy fool. So there's Foma, Ustin, and Carp, and Carp is killed. And so that ends this section. So the next section is the Book of Journeys. And the Book of Journeys begins with this talk of this guy named Ambrosio Flecchia. And it starts, and you kind of, I remember when I first read this book, I was like, what the heck's going on here? Are we starting like a new book? It kind of just starts out of nowhere. It's in Italy. It's at the same time period, but it's like a completely different character and setting. And so you're starting to wonder, what's going on? The story comes back to Arseny, but we have this kind of detour through Ambrosio Flecchia's life. And this is the Book of Journeys. So we're in a new book now. So we're going to notice a big change, not only in the story, but what's going on in Arseny's life. So essentially what happens is Ambrosio is introduced, and he's introduced as a kind of a prophet. He can kind of see things into the future, things in the immediate future, like when he tells his dad we need to harvest the wine, but also things literally like almost 1,000 years, or not 1,000 years, but like 500 years in the future. And so So this is all going on. It tells about him, and then he starts learning from a merchant that in Russia, they think the end of the world is happening in 1492, which is 7,000 years after creation. And he's really interested in this because he's obsessed with time because he sees into the future. But he's also kind of considering, how does time work? What's going on, and why do all these people have agreements, because it wasn't happening in Italy, that this is the end of the world. So that's all going on, and eventually Ambrosio makes his way to Russia, and while he's in Russia, he meets Mayor Gavril. And Gavril, if you remember, is the mayor of Pskov. And he kind of serves as a patron from Ambrosio. And as he's taking care of Ambrosio, he's kind of hearing all the stories that Ambrosio has to, all these stories Ambrosio has. It's also then that he says, can you go to Jerusalem? He wants him to go to Jerusalem for a couple of reasons, but one of the main ones is to take an icon lamp, and this is just a smaller lamp. Sometimes they could be very simple, sometimes they could be really ornate, that you would put before an icon. So in the Orthodox tradition, icons are such a big part of it, and icon lamps were a regular thing that would be kind of set up around icons. So he asked him to go, and it's right at this point that the text, and this is kind of around page, let me put this here, page 197, that the text reconnects to page 180. So we had left the text with Carp's death, and I should say it was a murder, and so we've left it for 17 something pages, and all of a sudden we return back to that, and so the text returns to that happening, explains why Samson killed Carp, and this marks this kind of point where Euston is no longer a holy fool, but instead returns back to Arseny. If you turn to 198, so at the bottom, Foma is speaking with Euston, and he says, Arseny says, "So what am I supposed to do now?" asked Arseny. "Carp invited you to heavenly Jerusalem, but you didn't become his traveling companion." This is Foma speaking. "Which is understandable. You wouldn't go there without Ustina. But go to earthly Jerusalem and pray for her to the Almighty." "But how will I get to Jerusalem?" asked Arseny. "I have this one idea," said Holy Fool Foma, "but for now, buddy, give me the bag with Christopher's manuscripts. You won't be needing them anymore." This is, again, another form of renunciation. He's been carrying these since he left Rukina. Everywhere he's gone, through everything that's happened to him, through all the little villages he's visited, through his time as a holy fool, he's held on to those. And now Foma's saying, you have to give me those. Arseny handed the bag with Christopher's manuscripts to Holy Fool Foma, but he felt mournful inside. As he handed over the bag, Arseny thought about how his attachment to property seemed to have stayed with him, and he was ashamed of this feeling. Holy Fool Foma grasped what was happening within Arseny's soul and told him, "Do not mourn, O Arseny, for Christopher's collected wisdom will enter you in an unwritten way. As far as the description of the herbs go, I reckon that's already ancient history for you. Heal the ill by taking their sins upon yourself. Herbs are not required for that sort of treatment, as I hope you understand. And also, from now on, you are not Euston, but Arseny, like before. Prepare, comrade, for the journey." So what's going on here is Euston is becoming Arseny, and he is no longer the holy fool, but is a pilgrim. So this is an important transition. It obviously happens because it's the book of journeys, so that's kind of self-evident, but it's important to us because that period of him as a holy fool is over. And so now he's moving into a new stage, into a new person. He's taking on the name Arseny, but he's kind of a different Arseny. He's a pilgrim now. And so what happens is Arseny and Ambrosio Flecchia are pilgrims on the way to Jerusalem, and they have this kind of mission to deliver the lamp and the icon lamp. And so what's going on during this point is we'll kind of get into that. We're just getting into it now, so I'm not going to say much, but I want you to pay attention to a couple things. Pay attention to the theological conversations going on between Ambrosio and Arseny. Arseny has just started speaking again, and he's kind of quiet and reserved, but he begins to speak more and more, and him and Ambrosio become friends, and they have a number of conversations on different things, like time, the role of God, eschatology, which is end times, so stuff like that. Pay attention to those conversations. Also, another thing to pay attention to is healings. Arseny continues healing. So throughout, whether he's a pilgrim, a holy fool, a healer in the sense of healing during the pestilence, he's always healing, and he's becoming more and more of a faith healer. That's something to pay attention to. So he heals that the boatman who's a thief, and then when they get to I think it's Kiev, when they get to Ukraine, he heals Commander Sergei. So pay attention to those things that he's healing. There's also a couple of things I wanted to point out now that we're kind of leaving this, and I'm opening up a couple quick questions before I end today's session. Remember when we had the introduction, I talked about this term Christian personalism, which is a term from the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, but it's something that Eugene Vodolazkin really likes. And it's this idea that history is made by people, but not this focus on like rugged individualism. It's these forces affecting history, larger forces, but ultimately this belief that it is the individual and the choices that the individual makes. This isn't rugged individualism in the sense that we're prioritizing the individual, but rather that the individual's choices have ramifications not only in their own life, but in the life of others and in history. And so there's two quotes I want to read. The first is 189. This is a really short one, but it's in the middle of the page. This is Ambrosio. The events he saw related to the histories of individual people, and it is they, or so it seemed to Ambrosio, who ultimately form world history. So this idea here is that it's a singular, not one person, but people that make history and not these larger forces. The second quote is on page 211. Right at above this chapter break. People are free, Ambrosio replied, but history is not free. As you say, there are so many intentions and actions that history cannot bring them all together, and only God can hold them all. I would even say that it is not people that are free, but the individual person. I liken the confluence of human wills to fleas in a container. Their movement is obvious, but do they really have a common purpose? That is why history has no goal, just as humanity has none. Only an individual person has a goal. And even then, not always. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but this is a pivotal part to the story, and I really want to hear your thoughts on that, so think about that. The other questions I had from this section are, what was the kind of point of the story of Eugene, the Holy Fool? What role did this play in the larger story? And what role did mortification or renunciation play? One thing to think about is these are not ends in themselves. So the point isn't becoming a holy fool, but essentially what is this leading to, right? We talked about this belief that repentance and salvation and faith is a journey, and so these are stages along the way. So these aren't ends, they're essentially a means. How is the holy fool a means to this larger end of salvation and repentance? And then I'm really interested to see what y'all think about Ambrosio. What role is he playing in the story? How does he counter who Arseny is? And how does he complement who Arseny is? So just think about his role in the story. We've just gotten into that part, and so there's not as much there to talk about, but it's a long section and it's an important one. So I'm going to leave it there. I didn't want to talk for long because hopefully most of you can join me. We're going to try to record the Zoom so that you can watch it even if you're not able to join. So we're trying to make as much available. As always, don't hesitate to contact me. I'm just Will. I'm not going to write it out. will@palmacia.org. I'm going to read the Lenten prayer of St. Ephrem the Syrian, which I have posted on my wall because it's one of my favorite Lenten prayers. And this will close us out. But know that the church is here for you. We're praying for you and we're thinking about you. And we're walking alongside you in this trying time. If you need anyone on the pastoral staff, do not hesitate to reach out. Check Facebook, check YouTube. We are constantly putting new material up. We want to walk alongside you in this, alongside you during this time as best we can. So let's close in prayer. O Lord and Master of my life, the spirit of idleness, despondency, ambition, and vain thoughts give me not, but rather a spirit of chastity, humble-mindedness, patience, and love bestow upon me thy servant. Yea, O Lord King, grant to me to see my failings and not condemn my neighbor. For thou art holy unto the ages of ages. Amen. Thank y'all and take care.